the power of Romans 8 verse 28. Have you ever heard someone say, "Don't worry, everything will work out"? Sometimes it's hard to believe that, especially when life gets tough. But Romans 8 verse 28 goes beyond simple optimism. Paul teaches us that all things work together for good for those who love God. And that's a powerful promise, isn't it? Now, let's be real. This promise doesn't mean life will be problem-free. Instead, it invites us to see challenges from a different perspective. Paul was writing to a group of Christians facing severe persecution. Yet, he encouraged them to trust in God's purpose, even when everything seemed lost. This message is just as relevant today as it was back then. Here's the thing. This passage isn't one of those that you read once and instantly understand. It has layers of meaning. When Paul says all things, he truly means all things. The good, the bad, and even the things we can't make sense of. It's a lot to unpack, right? So, in this video, we're going to dive deep into this promise. First, we'll explore the context in which it was written. Then, we'll discuss who those who love God are and how even life's difficulties can fit into God's greater plan. We'll also look at practical examples from the Bible and, most importantly, figure out how to apply this truth in our daily lives. But before we get into the details, let me ask you this. Have you ever considered how something as simple as trusting God can completely change your perspective? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see Romans 8 verse 28 in a whole new light. The context of Paul's letter to the Romans. To understand Romans 8 verse 28, we first need to step back and look at the letter as a whole. Paul wrote to the Christians in Rome, a church he hadn't yet visited. These believers lived under the rule of the Roman Empire, facing discrimination, persecution, and all kinds of hardship. Life was anything but easy for them. Now think about this. Paul had a mission. He wanted to strengthen their faith. And to do that, he wrote one of the most profound and theological books of the New Testament. Romans isn't just a beautiful text, it's a masterclass on God's plan for humanity. In chapter 8, Paul reaches the peak of his message, the assurance that all things work together for good for those who love God. What's fascinating is that, even amid so much suffering, Paul makes it clear that God is in control. He talks about how the Holy Spirit helps us in our weaknesses and how nothing can separate us from God's love. Romans 8 verse 28 shines like a beacon of hope in the middle of these truths. It's a reminder that there's a greater purpose behind everything. But here's an important detail. This promise isn't for everyone. It has a very specific audience, and Paul makes that clear. It's for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. But who are these people? Let's explore that next. Who are those who love God? Let's be honest. Not everyone can claim the promise of Romans 8 verse 28. Paul is very specific. It's for those who love God. But who are these people? Do you fit into that category? First, loving God doesn't mean being perfect. Thankfully, right? Loving God is about having a relationship with Him, putting Him at the center of your life. It's not something you do only with words, but with actions. As Jesus said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." It's about trust and obedience. Now, let's be real. Loving God is easy during the good times, but the real test comes during difficulties. Those who love God trust Him even when things don't make sense. Can you see beyond the problems and believe there's a bigger purpose? That's what sets apart those who truly live this promise. There's more. Those who love God are called according to His purpose. This means we're not here by accident. God has a specific plan for each of us, and when we understand that, it becomes easier to accept that even the hard times can work for our good. So, how do you apply this in real life? Start by cultivating a daily relationship with God. Pray, read the Bible, and most importantly, trust His plans, even when you don't understand why. But what about life's difficulties? Do they really fit into all things? Let's find out together. The concept of all things, even difficulties and challenges? All things. It's easy to accept this phrase when life is going smoothly, right? But what about when things spiral out of control? Did Paul really mean that even the toughest challenges can work for our good? The answer, surprisingly, is yes. First, it's crucial to understand that God doesn't cause evil. He is always good, but in his sovereignty, he can use even the hardest situations to fulfill his purposes. Take Joseph, for example, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and unjustly imprisoned. His life seemed like a disaster. Yet, in the end, he told his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." The truth is, we often can't see the big picture. Our perspective is limited, like someone looking at a single puzzle piece and trying to guess the whole image. But God sees the entire masterpiece. And the most amazing part? He's working behind the scenes, connecting the pieces of our lives into something greater. This means the pain you're feeling today isn't the end of the story. You might be facing a loss, a failure, or a situation that feels impossible. But remember, God doesn't waste anything. He can turn even the most difficult moments into something that brings growth and purpose. So, how do we live this truth? The key is to trust, even when everything feels dark. And if you're wondering how this plays out in real life, let's look at some biblical examples of people who lived this reality. Biblical examples of people who lived this truth. The Bible is full of stories of people who proved that all things work together for good. Let's start with Joseph. Betrayed by his brothers, sold as a slave, falsely accused, and imprisoned, his life seemed hopeless. Yet, in the end, Joseph became a ruler in Egypt and saved countless lives, including his family's. Another powerful example is Job. He lost everything: his family, wealth, and health. To make matters worse, his friends insisted he must have done something wrong to deserve such suffering. Yet Job remained faithful to God, even without understanding why he was suffering. In the end, God restored Job's life and blessed him even more than before. And then there's Moses. He spent 40 years in the wilderness as a shepherd before leading the Israelites to the Promised Land. Think about that. 40 years of waiting, likely feeling like his life had lost its direction. But God was preparing Moses, teaching him lessons that would be essential for his mission. Paul, the author of Romans, is another remarkable example. He endured shipwrecks, imprisonments, and persecution. Yet he wrote about joy, hope, and the assurance that nothing can separate us from God's love. Can you imagine where that confidence came from? Paul believed deeply that all things work together for good, even the painful ones. Finally, there's Esther, a young woman who became queen under unlikely circumstances and risked her life to save her people. She could have questioned why she was placed in such a challenging position, but instead, she recognized God's hand in it for such a time as this. These stories prove that Romans 8 verse 28 isn't just words, it's a living truth. And the best part? This promise isn't confined to the past. It's still valid for you, me, and everyone who trusts in God. But how can we apply these lessons in our daily lives? Let's talk about practical steps to live out faith in God's greater plan. Before we continue, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to be blessed with more videos to inspire your life. Practical application: having faith in God's greater plan. Now that we've seen how biblical figures lived out Romans 8 verse 28, it's time to bring this promise into our own lives. Knowing that all things work together for good is uplifting, but how can we truly live it out? How do we hold on to this faith when life feels overwhelming? Let's break it down into actionable steps. First, start each day by surrendering it to God. Life is unpredictable, but a simple prayer in the morning can anchor your heart in trust. Try saying, "God, I don't know what today holds, but I trust you to guide me through it." This daily habit will remind you to see every situation, good or bad, as part of His greater plan. Second, learn to shift your perspective on challenges. Let's be honest, no one enjoys hardships. But instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" ask, "What can God teach me through this?" For example, if you're facing a delay in something you've been praying for, maybe God is building your patience or preparing you for something greater. Joseph spent years as a prisoner, but those years refined him into the leader God needed him to be. Third, reflect on past situations where God turned difficulties into blessings. Grab a journal and jot down moments when things seemed hopeless, but later worked out in unexpected ways. Maybe it was a job you didn't get, only to land an even better opportunity, or a closed door that led to a new, more fulfilling path. Keeping these reminders handy can renew your trust during tough times. Fourth, surround yourself with people who share your faith. Facing life's challenges alone can feel unbearable. Find a community, a small group at church, a Bible study, or even a trusted friend, where you can share your struggles and hear about others' journeys. Sometimes, their stories of how God worked in their lives can reignite your hope. Finally, hold on to the truth that goods doesn't always mean immediate comfort. Sometimes, the good God is working on involves building your character, strengthening your faith, or using your story to impact others. Remember, God sees the big picture, even when we can't. The key is to keep trusting His plan, step by step. Living out Romans 8 verse 28 doesn't mean life will be easy. It means you can face life's twists and turns with confidence, knowing that nothing is wasted in God's hands. So, what does it look like for you to live with that unshakable trust? Let's dive into how this promise aligns with God's ultimate purpose for your life. God's purpose for every situation. If there's one thing Romans 8 verse 28 teaches us, it's that God's purpose is woven into every detail of our lives. Yes, every single detail. From the moments of joy to the seasons of heartbreak, nothing is wasted in His grand design. But what exactly does it mean to live according to God's purpose? Let's explore. First, God's purpose is about transformation, not just comfort. While we often wish for an easy, pain-free life, God's greater goal is to mold us into the image of Christ. Romans 8 verse 29 makes this clear. For those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son. Challenges, as painful as they may be, shape our character and deepen our relationship with Him. Like gold refined in fire, trials refine our faith. Second, His purpose goes beyond just us. Often, our experiences, both good and bad, are part of a larger story. Think about Esther. She may have wondered why she, an ordinary young woman, was placed in a royal position. But as the story unfolded, it became clear she was there to save her people. In the same way, your life can impact others in ways you might not even realize. Another aspect of God's purpose is preparation. Many times, the challenges we face are equipping us for something greater. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep, likely feeling forgotten and insignificant. But God was preparing him to lead His people out of Egypt. What feels like a delay in your life might actually be God laying the groundwork for something incredible. Then, there's the mystery of God's timing. We often want answers right away, but God operates on a timeline that's perfect, though rarely aligned with our expectations. It's like planting a seed. You don't see the growth immediately, but beneath the soil, something is happening. Trusting His purpose means trusting His timing, even when it doesn't make sense. Finally, God's purpose is always good, even when life doesn't feel that way. Remember, good in God's eyes doesn't necessarily mean comfortable or easy. It means growth, faith, and ultimately His glory. It's about drawing us closer to Him and using our lives to reflect His love to the world. Understanding God's purpose requires faith and patience. But it's worth asking yourself, what if the very thing you're struggling with right now is part of a greater plan to shape you, prepare you, and bless others through you? If that's true, then even the hardest moments carry meaning. So, how do we reconcile this promise with the pain we experience? Let's look deeper into how Romans 8 verse 28 applies in times of suffering. Understanding this promise in times of suffering. Let's be honest, Romans 8 verse 28 can be a hard truth to hold on to when you're in the middle of pain. How can we believe that all things work together for good when life feels like it's falling apart? Suffering is real, and this promise isn't about pretending it isn't. Instead, it's an invitation to see suffering through God's perspective. First, we need to remember that God doesn't dismiss or downplay our pain. The Bible shows us a God who is compassionate and deeply aware of our struggles. Psalm 34 verse 18 reminds us, The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. Even Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane, wept and expressed his anguish to the Father. If Jesus brought his pain to God, we can too. Second, suffering often feels meaningless, but with God, nothing is wasted. It's like a tapestry being woven from the backside. All we see are the messy threads, but the other side reveals a beautiful design. When Joseph was sold into slavery, he couldn't have imagined the purpose behind his pain. Years later, he recognized that God had been orchestrating everything for a greater good. Third, it's important to understand that God is present in our suffering, even when we don't feel him. Isaiah 43 verse 2 is a comforting reminder. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. Suffering doesn't mean God has abandoned you. In fact, it's often in those moments that his presence becomes the most powerful. Fourth, trusting Romans 8 verse 28 during hard times requires faith in what we cannot see. Hebrews 11 verse 1 says, "Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." Even when the purpose behind our suffering is unclear, we can trust that God sees the bigger picture. He knows how every piece of our story fits together, even when it looks like chaos to us. Finally, suffering can teach us to depend on God in ways we never would otherwise. It refines us, strengthens our character, and grows our faith. Think of Job. He lost everything, yet he clung to God. In the end, Job's faith was not only restored but deepened, and his story became a testament to God's faithfulness for generations. Suffering doesn't make Romans 8 verse 28 any less true. It makes it even more profound. It reminds us that God is working, even in the darkest moments, to bring about good. And as we reflect on this promise, it helps to remember real examples of people who experienced it firsthand. Let's dive into their stories. Biblical examples of people who lived this truth. The Bible is full of people who trusted that all things work together for good, even when their circumstances seemed impossible. These stories remind us that God's promise in Romans 8 verse 28 isn't just theory. It's been proven time and time again. Let's start with Joseph. His life was filled with betrayal and hardship. His own brothers sold him into slavery, and after years of loyal service, he was falsely accused and imprisoned. It would have been easy for Joseph to give up hope, but in the end, God elevated him to a position of power in Egypt, where he saved countless lives during a famine, including his family's. Joseph's words in Genesis 50 verse 20 are unforgettable. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Then there's Job. Few people endured as much suffering as he did. He lost his wealth, his children, and even his health, yet he refused to curse God. Job's story is a powerful example of unwavering faith in the face of unimaginable loss. By the end, God restored everything Job had lost, and more. But perhaps the greatest gift Job received was a deeper understanding of God's sovereignty and care. How about Moses? He spent 40 years in the wilderness as a shepherd after fleeing Egypt, likely feeling like his life had derailed. But God was using that time to prepare him for something extraordinary, leading the Israelites out of slavery. Moses' story reminds us that even seasons of waiting or apparent failure can be part of God's plan. Paul, the author of Romans, is another shining example. He faced imprisonment, shipwrecks, beatings, and rejection, yet his faith never wavered. He wrote about joy, hope, and God's purpose, even while sitting in a jail cell. Paul's confidence in God's promise wasn't based on his circumstances, but on his trust in God's plan. Finally, Esther's story is one of courage and divine timing. A Jewish girl who became queen in a foreign land, Esther risked her life to save her people from destruction. At first, she may have doubted her role, but her cousin Mordecai reminded her, "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Esther's bravery and trust in God's purpose changed the course of history. These examples prove that God's promise in Romans 8 verse 28 is real. It doesn't mean life will be easy or pain-free, but it does mean that God is always working behind the scenes, weaving every moment, good and bad, into his perfect plan. The question is, how do we live with that kind of faith today? Let's explore how to apply this truth in our daily lives. Practical application: living with faith in God's greater plan. Knowing that all things work together for good is one thing, but living it out, that's a daily challenge. How do you trust God's greater plan when life is chaotic, painful, or uncertain? Let's explore practical ways to apply Romans 8 verse 28 to your everyday life. First, start your day by surrendering it to God. A simple prayer in the morning can set the tone for your entire day. Try something like, "Lord, I don't know what today holds, but I trust you to use everything for my good and your glory." By making this a habit, you'll remind yourself to approach challenges with trust rather than fear. Second, choose to see challenges as opportunities. No one likes hard times, but they often teach us lessons we couldn't learn otherwise. For example, if you're facing rejection, a job you didn't get, or a relationship that ended, ask yourself, what is God preparing me for? It might be a better opportunity, a stronger character, or a deeper dependence on Him. Remember, Joseph didn't understand his trials until years later, but God was working all along. Third, reflect on past examples of God's faithfulness. Look back at times when something seemed like a setback, but turned out to be part of a greater blessing. Maybe you've experienced a delay that led to something better, or a struggle that strengthened your relationships. Keeping a journal of these moments can help you trust God when new challenges arise. Fourth, surround yourself with a supportive community. Life is hard enough without trying to handle everything alone. Find a small group, a Bible study, or even one trusted friend who can walk with you through tough times. Hearing how God has worked in others' lives can reignite your own faith and remind you that He's still at work in yours. Finally, remember that goods doesn't always mean immediate comfort. Sometimes the good God is working on is about transforming your heart, deepening your faith, or preparing you to impact others. It might not always make sense in the moment, but trusting God means believing that His plan is always better than ours. Living out Romans 8 verse 28 requires practice, patience, and perseverance. It's not about understanding every detail of God's plan, but about trusting Him in the midst of it. So, what would change in your life if you truly believed that every moment, good and bad, is part of God's perfect purpose? Romans 8 verse 28 is more than just a comforting verse. It's an invitation to trust in God's sovereignty and love, even when life feels uncertain. As you walk forward, hold on to this truth. God is working all things together for your good, and He never wastes a single moment. What about you? How has Romans 8 verse 28 impacted your life? Or how will you start applying this promise? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. If this message encouraged you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder of God's faithfulness. Let's spread this hope together.